Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone that is here. I know time is something really valuable that we all have, and the fact that you're giving it to us and being here today, it is really, really nice. And of course, thanks to Richard for doing the same, coming away from so far. We are really, really excited to be here. It's an honor for me. The first real book that I read in behavioral science was Natch. So for me, it's a great moment today. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Good. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, you are one of the main exponents for the field. How did you get to it? How did you get to the field, and what drove you to it from the beginning?
Well, when I was doing my PhD at the University of Rochester, well, there was no such thing as behavioral economics. And I was working on my thesis, which was on the value of a life. How much should governments be willing to pay to make something safer? And I was doing econometrics, how much do you have to pay people to get them to take risky jobs. But then I thought, oh, it might be fun to just ask people. So I asked people, how much would you have to be paid to take a 1 in 1,000 risk of dying? And then how much would you be willing to pay? You have this disease, how much would you be willing to pay to have a cure? And people would say things like they would pay $1,000 and they wouldn't take the risk for $1 million. And I thought, oh, well, that's odd. Economic theory says they have to be the same. And I went and showed this to my advisor. He said, go back to work. But then, you know, I started this list. If any of you have read Misbehaving, you know I had a list of funny things people do. And I was interested in that, but everybody told me I'm wasting my time. And then I discovered Kahneman and Tversky. Some people think they existed before that, but I discovered them and learned, they were in Israel at that time, but I learned that they were planning to spend a year in Stanford. And so I decided to spend a year in Stanford, and I say I stalked them. And that's how it all got started. The truth is I wasn't really very good at economics. And I mean, that sounds like false modesty, but no, that's just true. So I really needed to figure out something else. And this was the thing I could do.
And you found something that you were really good at.
Well, I was the best in the world at it.
And maybe you still have. And talking about that success, when did you figure out, like, would you realize that you had that aha moment and say, like, oh my God, this is becoming really big?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the real aha moment for me was when Baruch Fischoff told me about Kahneman and Tversky, and I started reading their papers. And the aha was the idea of systematic bias. Because economists knew that people were dumb. They thought everybody that's not an economist is dumb. So the idea of bounded rationality was a concept they were familiar with, like their students or their spouse or their dean or basically anybody they know. But they thought the random errors wash out, and so it doesn't matter. So this idea of systematic bias, the whole heuristics and biases program, so pre-prospect theory, that was the aha moment.
So in that moment, you kind of felt like the field was going to be...
Well, I thought, oh, there was something to do. That's all. I didn't know whether I'd ever get a paper published. And it was slow going. I mean, my first paper must have been rejected 8 times. I mean, rejected by every leading economics journal. So it was not an easy start. The weirdest thing was, I had a student at Cornell, where I moved, called Werner de Bont, a Belgian guy who wanted to do finance. And I said, I don't know anything about finance, but sure. So we started doing finance, and we wrote this paper based on his thesis called Does the Stock Market Overreact? It's a very simple paper. Take all the stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, rank them in terms of returns over the past 5 years, say, and then see how they do over the next 5 years. And the ones that did the worst go up, and the ones that did the best go down. And the efficient market hypothesis says they're the same. You can't predict the future from the past. Well, that paper caused a furor. And in fact, all the grad students, all the finance grad students at Chicago were given the assignment of finding de Bont's programming error, because that was the only possible explanation for these results. They knew it couldn't be right. So what was the mistake? There was no mistake. And so this is fun. So boom, we wrote another finance paper. And I had a much easier time getting papers published in finance than in economics. I never would have predicted that.
I actually love, one of my favorite videos in YouTube is your video with Fama, going back and forward if markets are efficient, and I really recommend it if someone hasn't watched it. It's really beautiful. Do you have any other of those curiosities that he says, or the ones mentioned in that video that you want to share with us? Well, you know, I've told you Fama's a golfer. Yes.
And so sometimes if we're playing golf, I'll harass him a little bit. And I asked him once what was more embarrassing to him, GameStop or Bitcoin? And he said, Bitcoin. I mean, GameStop, he thinks of these things as just annoying little examples, but Bitcoin offended his entire sensibilities because he says it shouldn't exist.
And does he have any explanation for it or nothing?
No, he doesn't. And he would be reluctant to admit it, but it baffles him.
And moving a little bit to a concept that we are hearing a lot in our field, which is the meta-analysis concept, and that Linnea mentioned it in her amazing presentation. What do you think about this meta-analysis? What do you think they bring to the field, and how do you think they are going to help us?
Well, if Linnea ever finishes that project...
She will.
You know, Linnea and I are pals, you know. We're off to London tomorrow to teach for a week. So I don't know how much she said about it yesterday, but if you dig in, what you find is it's a mess in there. And it's not clear what you can learn. So anyway, that's Linnea's story. My take on it is, you know, in these papers and some of the other papers that cite it, the conclusion is, well, the effect sizes are small. Now, we in the field say, yeah, but they're cheap, so return on investment is high, but effect sizes are small. And then there's a big discussion of publication bias. And the idea is that the bigger effects are more likely to be published. So what I like to bring up is something I call permission bias, which I think is much bigger. And that is the studies that get into the meta-analysis are by definition only the ones that somebody got permission to run, right? That's true by definition. If there isn't an RCT, it doesn't get into the meta-analysis. And what things do you get permission to run? They're the least intrusive to the organization. So we have hundreds of studies studying text messages or email messages or ways of phrasing something. And so let's call that messaging. And here, let me give you an example. Maya Shankar, who was the head of the White House Nudge Unit, at one point she was asked if she could increase the enrollment in the pension plan of civilian employees to the Defense Department. And she said, sure, yeah, I know how to do that. Automatic enrollment, automatic escalation, you know. And she was told, no, you can't do that. So what could she do? She could fiddle with an email you send to these people, and you get enrollment to go up from 3% to 5%, depending on how you word it. Which again, you know, that's not nothing, and it's free, but we know we could have gotten 90%. So, but you can't do that. And I think this is sort of a big problem for the field. And I don't know who to blame. I'm not blaming anyone. It's sort of a fact. Now, you know, when Cass and I wrote Nudge and coined the term choice architecture, we thought that is the core idea in that book, that and libertarian paternalism. And we thought of choice architecture as sort of an encompassing the whole, right? So all the things that are going on, you know, we talk about the cafeteria line at the beginning of the book, and you can think of it as a line, but of course there's lots of other stuff going on. There's, you know, aromas and appearances and maybe other things that are going on. If it's a school, they're talking about nutrition or not. So choice architecture is meant to be the entire environment in which people choose. And if you can manipulate that, then we thought you can make big things happen. How big? I don't think we know, because people are rarely given permission to completely redo the choice architecture. So I think there are a big sample of messaging studies that have positive effects, but a very small sample of choice architecture overhauls and what would happen if you got to do it.
And then if you do it, it is hard. It's really hard to have a control group for that. Like.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, Save More Tomorrow, automatic escalation. To this day, there's not RCT, as far as I know. Benarzi and I spent a few years trying to find one firm that would try it. And then we got that one firm, and all we had was a before and after. And then we got another firm to run two slightly different versions, but not a pure RCT because it was at two different plants, so not random assignment. And then people said, oh, this works. So now, you know, that's it. You don't get to do the RCT. And yeah, if you do something comprehensive, then of course there's no experiment. Now, there can be a before and after, and in large organizations, there is the chance to experiment at the level of a plant or a division, or Linny was complaining that I was going to launch into sports. So just to disappoint her, I'll do that. A friend of mine in California was the head of a Major League Baseball team, and I was trying to convince him to experiment with ideas in the minor leagues. And in fact, the Major League Baseball has done that with rule changes. So they'll start down, see if this works, and then build it up. So I think in big enough organizations, there are chances. I mean, that wasn't exactly an experiment, but it's like a pilot.
Yes.
And like they added a pitch clock, which sped up the game, shockingly. If you say you have to throw a pitch within 20 seconds, that speeds it up. So I think organizations do much less of that than they could. And you know, it could come from the bottom, but then they won't get permission.
Yes. Do you think that the more evidence they see, or do you think there is lack of evidence for now that prevents from organizations to do it more in a holistic way? Or do you think we're going to see it more often as we keep on growing in evidence?
You know, there's enormous status quo bias. And how often when you're in a company and you say, why do you do it this way? They say more or less because that's the way we always have done it. You know, why do you have dinner at 8:30 in Spain? Because that's the way we've always done it, yes. Right? So did somebody solve for the optimal time to have dinner, and somehow the equation, there was a mistake in Spain, and you know,
and Greece. Spain and Greece. Yes.
Spain just, you know, it should have been 7:30, but an addition error or something. So now the whole country can't sleep because they eat dinner too late. So, right? So there are lots of things we do that we do for tradition and no better reason. And if you want to say, well, we should do it some other way, then you have to convince somebody that, or you have to be in charge.
Completely. Going back a little bit to sports, sorry, sorry.
Good.
Because I know there's a few golfers here. They would like you to know, do you have any ideas for the game of golf to make it more appealing, attractive, better?
Yeah, make the cup bigger.
How much bigger, though?
No, so here's...
It's not a joke, huh?
Well, do you know... Do you know why the cup is that size?
I read the article, I don't remember.
Yeah. The answer is in St. Andrews, they were tired of digging holes. They went to the local plumber and they said, what's the biggest pipe you have? And it's 4 5/8 inches or something like that. That's the size of the hole. And again, did somebody optimize that, and decide, well, if you made it this much bigger, it would be more or less fun? So, yeah, I would make the cup bigger.
The cup bigger. Any other that you have?
That's enough.
That's enough.
Okay. By the way, Fama agrees with me about
On
that.
that one. He's not a great pattern then.
He says 2 club lengths, gimme.
Gimme. He goes for the gimmies.
Yeah, he goes for the gimmies.
Okay. Give me some mulligans then for fun. And going back to the restaurants and knowing that you are quite a foodie, do you have an example on that field or that industry on someone that has applied behavioral science in a big way?
Well, I don't know whether it's behavioral science. Actually, this is a friend of Linnea and me. There's a guy named Nick Kokonis who was made some money as a trader in Chicago back when we had the options and commodity markets. And then he was a foodie, and there was a young chef that he discovered, and Grant Atchis, and he said, Grant, I'd like to build you a restaurant. So he opened a restaurant called Alinea, and it turned out to be a great restaurant, 3-star, top 50 in the world kind of place. But like a lot of these restaurants, it was very hard to get in. And he realized one day he was paying 5 people to answer the phone and say, no, you can't have a reservation. And maybe there's some better way. So he got somebody to build an online reservation system. No big deal with that. But then he had the disruptive idea of if you want to book, you pay. So this is an expensive restaurant. Let's say the meal is $250. You want to book a table for 4, that'll cost you $1,000. Just like a plane ticket or a theater ticket or a Real Madrid ticket. So now that's common for all those domains, but not for restaurants. So as soon as he did that, no-shows fell to 2% from 15%. If we had a big snowstorm, people from the suburbs would skip it. So, this goes right to the bottom line. Then tables for 2 or 4, not 3. Why? Well, a table for 3, he could have had a third more. So now, all right, so now he's full and guaranteed. And then he opens up another restaurant. And I won't go into the details of that restaurant. It's called Next. But they have different themes. And one of the themes was going to be Chicago Steakhouse deconstructed. But he needs some steak. So he goes around looking for the best steak, and he finds some rancher in Sonoma that has the best beef. And he says, okay, how much would you charge me for whatever he's going to need for 4 months of this menu? And the guy quotes him some price, $50 a pound, some outrageous price. And Nick says, okay, but suppose I guarantee you 4 months and I'll pay you in advance. 40% off. So now notice what he's doing. He's borrowing money from his customers, loaning it to his supplier, and reducing the cost of his most expensive ingredient by 40%. So if you have a business, you want this guy Nick to run it. So the ticketing service, he then sold that to other restaurants and then sold that company. It was called TOC for a lot of money. So, you know, I don't know whether there's much behavioral science there, but there's a lot of common sense. And what Nick was good at is just asking, why do we do it that way? Why are we paying somebody to say you can't have a table? Why do we allow no-shows? Why do we allow tables for 3 or 5 when we could be sitting another person at that table? And I can tell you that restaurant was very profitable, and most restaurants like that are not. It looks, if you look at the price, you say, oh my God, of course they're making a lot of money, but they're not, because there's a lot of food wastage, and again, if somebody doesn't show up, you've just lost all that money. So.
And those are the type of efforts or actions that escape meta-analysis, for example.
Yeah, for sure. He's not in anybody's study. I mean, another example of breaking things is Netflix. The guy who started Netflix, Reed Hastings, some of you are not going to be old enough to remember the video stores. So when VHS came along, all of a sudden there were little stores that popped up where you could go and rent a video. And then that got driven out of business by one Blockbuster, was a national chain of video stores. And the guys who came up with the idea for Netflix tried to sell it to Blockbuster, and Blockbuster said, nah, we don't think it's a good idea. So what happened was, this was when the CD was first coming in, and they got the idea, all right, we'll let you order online and we'll mail it to you. And the CD was easier to mail than a big VHS tape. And now the interesting mental accounting aspect of this is video stores would charge, say, $5 for a 2-night rental. And then if you didn't return it on time, there was a late fee. People hate the late fee. They really hated the late fee. And Netflix, the pricing model was $10 a month. You get 3 movies. When you return one, we send you another one. No late fees. But you keep paying the $10 a month. So that basically drove Blockbuster out of business. Now streaming comes along. A lot of companies, there would be some new company that will drive Netflix out. No, somehow they transitioned from the mailing the envelopes to online very smoothly. For a while, coexisted. Eventually, they ended the mail order. Another completely different business, disruption. Then they decide to go into content creation. Completely different business. And at most companies, especially when they got to that part, they would say, look, no, we're in the business of delivering envelopes. We're not in the business of making shows. Now, that's often a good thing. Like, even my friend Nick, if he's running a restaurant, he probably doesn't want to go into the clothing business although knowing Nick, he could figure out a way to make money at that. But, and so I'm not saying that everybody should jump into new lines of businesses, but sometimes they should. And when the world is changing, sometimes you gotta change. And so I think status quo bias is the biggest problem in most organizations, and sludge. So, you know, the sludge is an idea we introduced in the second and final edition, no matter what Cass may have said yesterday. There's not going to be another edition of that book.
Why?
That's why I called it the final edition. It's a commitment strategy, because Cass would have wanted to write a new one every year. So we introduced this idea, sludge, which is, you know, our motto for nudge is make it easy. And sludge is what makes it hard. And in a lot of companies, there's all kinds of sludge. In order to do something, just, you know, to buy something, the amount of steps you have to take. At the University of Chicago, they've installed some new accounting system that makes it 3 times harder to book an airline ticket. I have no idea what the gains are, but I can see the downsides of it. And so I lost my train of thought. Where were
Sludge.
Sludge, right. So the sludge just prevents companies from moving forward. And in order to get something approved, you need 5 levels of approvals. And so, you know, I think if we bring this back to the kinds of things you guys are interested in, how can you do large-scale organizational choice architecture? For sure, you need CEO buy-in. If you don't have that, you're doomed. And it better be a CEO who's going to be around for a while, right? Not a CEO in his or her last 2 years. You need somebody who's starting out and is willing to rock the boat. And because you need permission. And you need everybody in the organization asking, why do we do it this way? And not settling for, that's the way we've always done it.
Are you hopeful for that change to happen?
Not optimistic, but I think there are opportunities. And you know, if a few companies are willing to undertake an ambitious organizational change, then, and it works, then people will copy it. Because that'll be the new way that you do things.
Apart from the fact of having the buy-in of CEOs, what other recommendations do you have for organizations on how behavioral science can help them and to be used, how it should be used?
Well, I think the biggest opportunity for most large companies and for behavioral science and generally is to reform HR. Human resource department is the weak link in virtually every large company. And I've said that a bunch of times. At large companies, no one's ever disputed it.
It's really complex to get into HR.
What's that?
It's tremendously complex to get behavioral science within HR.
Yeah, well, but you know, companies, I'll tell you a story. And you'll be happy to know there's sports involved.
Fantastic.
So
Finally.
I'm friends with a guy who's the general manager of a basketball team. And I brought him to speak to the top 300 people at a large financial services company. And we did an interview like this, only I was interviewing him. So I start by saying, what's the size of your roster? How many players do you have? He says, 15. I said, okay. How many quants do you have working for you in helping you pick this roster? 15. I said, okay, so 1 quant per employee. That's the ratio. Then I turned to these people. I said, how many employees do you have? 2,000. How many quants do you have in HR? 0. Now, this is a company full of quants. They're portfolio managers, right? Yes. They have PhDs in math and statistics and economics and finance. It's not like this is a company that doesn't understand quantitative methods. They just don't think you use that over in HR. And HR is one of the places that produces sludge. In order to hire somebody, you have to do all these things. And, you know, how do we decide who to hire? Talk about a place to experiment. You know, that's just a bad word in HR. I mean, it's the same with student selection. I've tried for 3 or 4 decades to get whatever university I was at to, let's say we're taking a class of 600 entering MBA students. Let's experiment with 50 of them. You know, it can't be that the difference between the 600th and the 700th is really all that different. And, you know, suppose we say, all right, we're going to have 50 wild cards, and we're going to value other things other than the GMAT and whatever. What terrible thing could happen? I don't know what terrible thing could happen, but I don't know of any place that's tried it. Wharton has actually a pretty smart admissions office, partly because of my buddy Kate Massey, who I wrote a paper with about, football, yeah, that's right. So I think, you know, there's no, you know, companies like that company don't send their brightest young managers into HR because it's a one-way trip. And there's almost never anybody coming out of HR going to be CEO. And why is that? I mean, the company is nothing more than its employees, just like the basketball team is nothing more than the 15 players. So why wouldn't, if we are doing a scientific approach to buying stocks and bonds, why wouldn't we have a scientific approach to hiring people? So, and you can see there's all kinds of behavioral science that would be quite substantive. And should we be hiring all people that are that look alike? Should all the portfolio managers have MBAs from top schools or math degrees, or maybe there's other stuff that we should be doing? Let's try a few, you know? So
And with the efforts that you've done, like for example this talk that you did in front of that company, have you been able to get anything on that field? Do you have any examples that you can share?
You know, they say that because of me, they run their meetings differently. They let the young people talk first, you know. I haven't seen any big changes in HR because I think if you're the CEO, you have to choose your battles. And so that's probably not a battle the CEO is willing to fight.
Makes sense. Do you have any advice for companies that are in this space on how to do it?
Well, interviews are almost certainly useless or nearly useless.
Wow.
And I mean, it's argued that a structured interview has some predictive value. So there are good and bad ways to do interviews. The best way is they're basically tests. So I'm involved with a small money management firm that uses behavioral to invest in stocks. What we do when we're interviewing, like for, say, a portfolio manager, we'll send the candidate an academic paper to read and say, we want you to read this, and we may ask you about it. And it's not that we're expecting them to write papers, but we'd like them to be able to read them and think about them. And we'd say, you know, do you see anything in that paper that you might be able to use? And then before we hire anybody, now we only hire people that have done a 6-week internship in the summer. So we make it a...
You've seen an improvement in retention and in quality of work?
Well, we've hired some very good people. We're a very small firm. We only have 25 people, so it's a small N, but the people we've hired this way have been very good. Very good to outstanding. So I don't know. And
It's working.
It's working, yeah. But there's no RCT, so it won't get into linear study.
No, it won't. I feel a little bit obliged to ask this question because it's really everywhere. We're talking about a world in which AI is going to shape a lot of things right now. What do you think the role of a behavioral scientist is going to be in that world, if you have an idea?
My answer is I have no idea. And I think, I was talking to a couple people about this earlier, I think it's too soon to tell. The analogy I use is when the iPhone came out. Cass and I both got our first smartphones the year we started working on Nudge, 2007. He got a BlackBerry. God, that was an ugly thing. But anyway, if you were around at that time, try to imagine how the world is going to change because people have a computer in their pocket. You'd have no idea. Would it occur to you that there'll be a map in your pocket? Will it occur to you that because of that, you could create a company like Uber? Right? Uber doesn't exist without the smartphone and the GPS. Otherwise, they can't find you. So, you know, I remember when there was a famous ad where Steve Jobs introduced it, and he's swiping, and people go, ah, you know, it was so cool, oh. but nobody knew what the thing was good for. And so, I think that's kind of where we are with AI right now. It does a lot of good tricks, but it makes a lot of very dumb mistakes. I have 3 kids, and we have a Wordle text group. And if you don't know Wordle, you have to guess a 5-letter word. And there's lots of trash talking in this group. And one of my daughters is into making cocktails. And my son was teasing her that her opening word was probably boozy. But then he asked ChatGPT to give him a list of 10 5-letter words that had alcohol as part of the theme, okay? Out of the 10 words, only 8 had 5 letters. One was mead, 4 letters. One was scotch, 6 letters. Now, you would think AI, the future of the world, can count the letters, right? That's pretty basic. So, these people that think that AI is going to take over the world, and yeah, maybe, but when it can count up to 5, then I'll be more impressed. And, maybe it will change the world, but I think it's too early for us to be playing a game of how it's going to change things, because I don't think we know. I mean, it seems obvious to me that call centers are going to be toast, because there'll be a chat that will be better, but not now, because, if it's telling you how to fix this problem and it makes your phone blow up, that's not going to be good. So I don't know. I think we need some humility.
I agree. And one easier one. For those organizations that are a little bit on the fence on using behavioral science, would you have any recommendation for those CEOs? What would you tell them on how to start? And
I would. So I can tell you my approach when we started the Nudge Unit in the UK. Now, first of all, think about this. Cass and I were 2 professors. We write a book that nobody wants to publish. And 2 years later, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, decides to start a group of behavioral scientists doing policy. They had put this in their manifesto, which I didn't know what a manifesto was. It's like what in America we call a platform, only they mean it. Whereas platforms are just, I don't know, wishes. So they call me up and say, hey, we're going to do this. You better come and tell us how to do it. I said, well, I don't know. We just wrote a book. We don't know how to do it. So, but I went and spent some time, and we would go talk to some minister. And here's what we wouldn't do. We wouldn't say, here's our list of 10 tricks. Which one could we use? There's defaults, there's social norms, there's loss of, right? I never once did that. I would say, what's your biggest problem? Let's think about that. And now, is there some way that we might be able to help? So one of the early wins that basically got this whole group going was we went to see a guy whose job it was to collect money from people who owed money on their taxes. And, oh, okay, it was, you know, hundreds of millions of pounds. And we said, well, what do you do? We send them a letter. Okay, can we read the letter? Yeah, here's the letter. Oh, okay. Well, we might be able to improve this letter. Okay, so we start with the problem, and now, you know, now we can do the thing we're all familiar with. We write 5 different versions of the letters using our favorite tricks, and one of the letters works better, and they get lots of money. Okay, so, but you start with the problem, you don't start with the solution. And I think there are lots of problems. You know, my friend Nick with the restaurant, what's his problem? Is he's paying people to say, no, you can't have a reservation, and he has a lot of no-shows. That's his problem, and that's the problem he decided to solve. And there are problems all over the place that things take longer. There are 5 levels of approval are needed, right? Let's start with some of that and not with the solutions.
Makes sense. If you want, I want to let Sylvia to ask us a few questions.
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah?
Okay, so for now, Sylvia, please, if you can.
Well, thank you. It was a big discussion if we would go for the Q&A for the public, but thank you so much for allowing it and to give space Gonzalo and don't take all the time.
I'm tired of hearing his questions.
I know, right?
I knew it.
Okay, there are quite some questions actually, but we have some time, yep. I will start with this question. Do you think private sector should use behavioral intervention even if its impact cannot be rigorously measured?
Well, let me take a, you know, I'm going to do what my students do when we ask a question that they don't know what the answer is, which is answer something else. But if you remind me, I'll come back to that question. But a question we didn't discuss is something about the ethics. And it's clear, you know, when I sign a book, I sign it Nudge for Good. I've signed thousands of books, Nudge for Good. And it's because every trick we know can be used for good or evil. If I read a book about swindling and selling, all the scams, and all the scams are basically making use of behavioral science. I mean, the person running the scam wouldn't have called it that, but they had figured that out. Mr. Ponzi had figured it out. So I think you have to decide what kind of company you want to run. And you know, I'm very happy. One of the last things that the Biden administration will have done is pass a rule that they're calling one-click unsubscribe. So you have to be able to unsubscribe the way you subscribe. If you subscribe with one click, they can't make you call and stay on hold for an hour. Now, I have lots of friends at the New York Times that has a very sludgy unsubscribe process. I've tried to convince them that this is not a good way to run a business, including the CEO, and I got nowhere, so there's going to be a rule. If it's my business, you know, our little money management business, we wouldn't do stuff like that. we make plenty of money. We don't need to trick our customers into something that if they realized they wouldn't approve of. So I think let's draw a line that if we're doing something to our employees or to our customers, it should be something that they'll benefit from. And that's a hard and fast rule. Linnea and I will be telling our students, our MBA students, that next week in our class. So as to whether you should run an experiment if you don't know what's going to happen, of course. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. I think, you know, would I run an experiment, save less tomorrow? You know, quit the plan today? No. So I wouldn't do something that I thought was going to hurt people, but the whole point of experiments is you don't know. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for mentioning this, because I think it was part of this 2 days conversation about what type of organizations we want for us in the future. And with the idea of behaviorally driven organizations is what we want to push ethically using behavioral science into our organizations. And continuing a bit in the ethical part, there was a question about this large audit that you mentioned, and also Cass Sunstein mentioned yesterday. And it was about what do you think about it, and how do you think we can reduce this friction for our customers using behavioral science more ethically? So in this sense, what is your advice on nudging for good? What shall we do? What organization can do for, you know, actually apply behavioral science ethically?
You know, I think in the UX world, the user experience world, one of the biggest problems is that the coders and the programmers have what we call curse of knowledge. So they know how to do it. They think you're an idiot if you don't. And they clearly don't do enough testing with neophytes using old equipment. And that's kind of inexcusable. Thank God for YouTube videos, right? Because companies have, it used to be that the instruction manual was written in some language and then translated into something resembling your language and then unintelligible. They just stopped that, and there's a YouTube video. And those are pretty good, but I think trying it out on neophytes is going to help a lot.
Thank you so much. And for concluding, there is this one that is pretty interesting. Imagine if you could go back in time, what advice would you give to your young self?
Oof. You know, I don't know. I'm not somebody that ever had a plan. And I had a plan to go stalk Kahneman and Tversky. But I didn't have a backup plan if they said, we don't want to talk to you. And then after I did that and I thought, oh, this is interesting, what next? I don't know. Think of something. So, you know, why did we write Nudge? Because I wrote a 8-page paper on libertarian paternalism that I published in the American Economic Review. Cass wrote a 100-page paper in a law review with 73 footnotes. I think I'm underestimating, probably 300 footnotes. And I printed this thing out, and it looked like a book. And I said, oh, we've got a book. And Cass, you know, he writes books like in his sleep. So I mistakenly thought that we had a book. You know, there was 2 years. I'm slower than him. So there was 2 very hard years of writing. But it's not like we planned to write a bestseller. We planned to write a book, and we hoped somebody would read it. We had 2 people in mind when we were writing this book. When I write an academic article, I usually think of somebody, like a finance article, it would be Gene Fama.
Of course.
Right? I want my
Go-to guy.
my frenemy to, I say, because I want to preempt his first 3 objections. So when we were writing this book, we had 2 people in mind, one liberal, one conservative, that we thought it would be good if they read it. One was his colleague, Barack Obama, who later did something. And the other was David Brooks, who was then considered a conservative columnist for the New York Times. Conservative has moved. But, you know, then they both read it. But that was our ambition, was to have the 2 people read it, and then a couple million more read it. But it wasn't a plan.
Makes sense. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Thaler.